From cartoon ponies being dragged into hell to beloved heroes bleeding out on the battlefield, 1980s cartoons traumatized kids who just wanted to enjoy Saturday morning TV. We're exposing the darkest scenes that somehow made it into children's shows, with no warning at all. Among all the action-packed sequences of Transformers, the movie, one stands as one of the most traumatizing events for Transformers fans and 80s kids everywhere. The death of Optimus Prime. He wasn't injured. He wasn't taken prisoner. He died, slowly, on screen, in front of millions of children who had grown up treating this robot like a member of their own family. And the most brutal part? It wasn't even done for the sake of storytelling. It was done to sell new toys. The movie opens with a whole planet dying. Optimus dies, Megatron dies. A whole lot more die as the film plays out. From the very first frame, this was not the Transformers kids thought they were walking into. The TV show had run for 2 full seasons. 65 episodes of Autobots and Decepticons trading laser blasts back and forth. Nobody actually dying. Nobody actually suffering any real consequences. It felt safe, permanent, and then the movie obliterated all of that within the first act. In the midst of a pitched battle, Prime engaged in a brutal fight with Megatron. At first, it looked like the kind of confrontation seen in the TV series a dozen times. But as the fight wore on, there were odd signs that things were about to get nasty. Prime is stabbed in the abdominal area first with what appears to be a huge piece of shrapnel and then a laser sword. And then something shocking happened. Megatron shot Prime repeatedly in the chest. Kids in the theater froze. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Optimus Prime always won. He always got back up. He always had one more rallying speech left in him. One more moment where the Autobots pulled together and the bad guys got pushed back. But not this time. Not long after, audiences watched as the light from Optimus Prime's eyes went out, and then he turned gray. That image, the color literally draining out of the most iconic animated hero of the decade, seared itself into a generation's memory permanently. The death scene itself was prolonged and agonizing. Prime didn't just fall in battle, and that was it. He was carried back to the Autobot base, laid on a medical slab, and the film took its time showing him deteriorate. His voice got weaker, his movements became labored, and then, surrounded by the Autobots, who looked up to him as a leader and father figure, he delivered his final words and passed the matrix of leadership to Ultra Magnus. The camera held on his face as the life left his eyes, as his body went from vibrant red and blue to lifeless gray metal. For a child watching this unfold, the message was clear. Even your heroes can die. Even the strongest, bravest, most noble character in your favorite show can be broken and killed, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely wild. Prime's death wasn't a casualty of narrative necessity. While the bold choice to kill off this fan-favorite character gave the movie the type of no-one-is-safe stakes rarely afforded in animated films at the time, the motives behind that decision would ripple across the franchise for more than 3 decades. Hasbro wanted to clear shelf space. The death of Optimus Prime, the single most beloved character in the franchise, was essentially a marketing strategy. Screenwriter Ron Friedman, who had several animated episodes of G.I. Joe and Transformers under his belt, when he was tapped to write the film, strongly urged Hasbro not to kill off their flagship character. Friedman saw Prime as more than just a leader. He was a father figure to the Autobots, one that Hasbro should not be so quick to retire. He saw what the executives apparently couldn't, that this character meant something real to children, that there was an emotional bond that went far beyond plastic and paint. Hasbro ignored him completely. The executives had a simple calculation. Old toys don't sell when they're still on TV. Kids won't beg their parents for new characters if the old ones are still around. So the solution was to eliminate the old guard, violently, permanently, and in a theatrical release that would ensure maximum impact. It was cynical, it was calculated, and it traumatized millions. For kids who loved Optimus Prime, the Transformers massacre was akin to Walt Disney shooting Mickey Mouse to death in the middle of Fantasia. Hasbro had completely failed to predict how kids, not to mention their exhausted parents, would react to Prime's death. The backlash was instantaneous and overwhelming. A lot of kids evidently had trouble with that scene, and they were not coming out of their rooms and hiding under beds. Children were genuinely traumatized to the point of locking themselves away. Parents wrote angry letters. Critics questioned whether the film was appropriate for children, and Hasbro, for the first time, realized they'd miscalculated badly. They'd thought they were killing a toy. Instead, they'd killed something that had taken on a life far beyond what they'd intended. Story consultant Flint Dill later expressed surprise at the level of grief the event provoked. "We didn't know that he was an icon," Dill said, still seemingly baffled by the response. "It was a toy show. We just thought we were killing off the old product line to replace it with new products." That statement, "we just thought we were killing off the old product line," revealed everything about how disconnected the creators were from their audience. They saw merchandise, the kids saw family. The response was so intense that it changed the trajectory of a completely different film. The reaction that kids had regarding Optimus Prime's death affected G.I. Joe, the movie, as well, and they changed Duke's fate from dying to surviving after being in a coma. You saw a venomous snake bite Duke through the heart with actual blood splatter, but he lived to be okay. Hasbro certainly didn't want more backlash from angry parents with kids that had their hearts crushed. But really, Duke's death was more violent and shocking to see than Optimus Prime's. The snake bite, the blood, the human facial expression, all of it was already animated and done. They just changed the ending. The panic at Hasbro after Prime's death led to frantic rewrites of other projects in development. Characters who were scheduled to die got last-minute reprieves. Death scenes that had already been animated got softened or edited out entirely. The lesson had been learned: you can't just kill characters. Kids love and expect them to move on. But the damage to Transformers, the movie, was already done. The film underperformed at the box office, not because it was bad, but because word spread quickly among parents that this wasn't a safe movie to take their kids to. The merchandise for the new characters, Rodimus Prime, Ultra Magnus, RC, sat on shelves because kids didn't want them. They wanted Optimus back. The experience of Prime's death was so traumatic that a letter-writing campaign was launched, and it persuaded the studio to bring Optimus Prime back to life for a limited time. Optimus returned for a two-part episode titled The Return of Optimus Prime. The children had spoken, and Hasbro, for once, actually listened. But even the resurrection carried its own trauma. The two-part episode featured a plague that turned everyone infected into hate-filled monsters who attacked anyone near them. The Autobots and Decepticons, ancient enemies, had to work together to survive while slowly succumbing to the infection themselves. When Prime finally returned, he arrived to a world that had descended into madness and violence. The message was clear. Even bringing him back couldn't undo what his death had done. Transformers. The movie wasn't a particularly big success at the time, but it retains a cult following, and the death of the Autobot leader is still talked about today. What started as a cynical business decision accidentally became one of the most emotionally devastating moments in the history of children's animation, and every single kid who sat in that theater or watched that film on VHS carried a piece of it with them. The film also killed off other beloved characters, Ironhide, Ratchet, Prowl, Brawn, Wheeljack, in rapid succession during the opening battle. But none of those deaths hit like Prime's, because Prime was the one who mattered. Prime was the one who represented everything good about the Autobots, and watching him die taught an entire generation that nothing is permanent, nothing is safe, and even your heroes are mortal. Now, if the death of Optimus Prime wrecked you emotionally, the next entry on this list went somewhere even darker, because at least Prime was a robot. At least there was some comfortable distance between the fictional sci-fi world of Cybertron and the real one. The BraveStarr episode, called The Price, had no such buffer. It planted both feet in brutal, unsparing reality, and then it let a child die. In 1987, a new kind of lawman showed up on the cartoon scene. On the distant planet of New Texas, Marshal BraveStarr protected the locals from outlaws trying to steal a valuable mineral called carium. BraveStarr was a Native American, and in an era when pop culture was still full of stereotypes. The studio behind He-Man put an indigenous character front and center, giving him spirit animal powers like the strength of a bear and eyes of a hawk. The show had a moral lesson at the end of every episode, standard stuff for Filmation productions of that era. But episode 26 was not standard anything. The show's most shocking moment was in an episode called The Price. This wasn't your typical adventure. It was a heartbreaking anti-drug story that pushed the limits of children's TV. The episode shows a young boy getting hooked on a drug called Spin, and the story does not pull any punches. We watch the boy become an addict, his life spiraling out of control until, in a move that is still staggering for a kid's cartoon, he dies from an overdose. Let that sink in. A Saturday morning cartoon made for children showed a child character die from a drug overdose. Not implied, not off-screen. A child gets addicted to this space drug, steals some ore, and sneaks off to his clubhouse, where his lifeless body is found the next morning. A teenage boy named Jay becomes hooked on spin and gets progressively more focused on getting more. His best friend Brad watches the whole thing happen and is caught in an agonizing position. He knows something is wrong. He knows Jay needs help, but Jay has made him promise not to tell. The peer pressure is unbearable. The dealer works Jay like a professional, playing the friend, the cool older guy, the one who gets it, while quietly tightening the grip of addiction around a boy who doesn't understand what's happening to him. The episode doesn't just show Jay using spin once and moving on. It shows the progression. The first time, he's hesitant, nervous, but the high makes him feel invincible. He can jump higher, run faster, see better. It's everything a kid dreams of having, and that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. Because the next time he sees the dealer, the hesitation is gone. He wants more, and the dealer is happy to provide it. Before long, Jay becomes hooked. He falls into a downward spiral of dependency, to the point where he even steals from his mom's purse just to finance his obsession. The animation shows his face changing, darker circles under his eyes, his movements becoming more erratic, his expressions shifting from joy when he's high to desperate craving when he's not. For a children's cartoon, the level of detail in depicting addiction was unprecedented. Brad's internal conflict is equally devastating. He watches his best friend deteriorate. He sees Jay lying to his mother, skipping school, sneaking away to meet the dealer. And every time Brad tries to bring it up, Jay shuts him down, makes him feel like a bad friend for even suggesting something is wrong. The manipulation is textbook, and the show depicts it with uncomfortable accuracy. While Bravestar demolishes the factory producing spin, he's unable to help Jay, who pays the ultimate price. Bravestar busts up the drug ring, but Jay, the kid the audience has been following through the bulk of the episode, dies from his addiction, much to the grief of his mother and his friend Brad, who has to live with knowing Jay might be alive if he'd told someone sooner. Despite Bravestar stopping the production of Spin and Brad finally asking for help, it was too late to save Jay. The moment Bravestar arrives at the clubhouse and removes his hat is devastating in a way that animated TV almost never achieves. When he discovers Jay overdosed, he takes off his hat as he tells 3030 that it's too late to call Doc Clayton. No miracle. No last-second reversal, just a marshal standing over the body of a boy who didn't have to die. The animation lingers on Jay's body. They don't show his face, but they show enough, his hand outstretched, the empty vial of spin nearby, Bravestar's shadow falling across the scene as he processes what he's seeing. And then the camera cuts to 3030's face, Bravestar's cyborg horse companion, and even he looks stricken, because everyone knew, everyone could see where this was heading, and nobody could stop it. Jay's mother breaks down in 3030's arms when she and the others find Jay's corpse. And at the very end, the shaman, watching Jay's funeral from a distance, sheds a single tear. The funeral scene is brief but brutal. We see a small gathering, Jay's mother still crying, Brad staring at the ground, unable to look at the grave, Bravestar standing at attention, his face set in grim acceptance. And hovering over all of it is the question, was this worth it? Did this death prevent others? Or did a child die for a lesson that could have been taught differently? There was no last-minute rescue or magical cure. The creators wanted to show the real, irreversible consequence of drug addiction. For kids who were used to seeing heroes always save the day, the price was a shocking and unforgettable lesson that some dangers are all too real. PSA cartoons about substance use are nothing new, but to have one as effectively bleak as this should hopefully scare anyone straight. And it did. Anyone who watched The Price as a child didn't forget it. Not because it was gratuitous or exploitative, but because it treated young viewers with enough respect to show them the truth, unvarnished. The episode was dedicated to the memory of a real person, Raymond Hamada, which made it hit even harder. This wasn't just fiction. Somebody real was behind it. The dedication at the end of the episode reads, "In memory of Raymond Hamada." No explanation, no context, just a name. And for kids watching, that was enough to understand that this wasn't just a story. Someone out there, someone real, had died the way Jay died, and Bravestar was trying to make sure it didn't happen again. The episode closes with Bravestar speaking directly to the camera. No jokes, no adventure teases, just Bravestar looking at the audience, telling them that drugs are dangerous, and that if they or someone they know is using, they need to talk to an adult. The usual moral of the story segment that ended every Bravestar episode became something heavier, something that felt less like a lesson and more like a warning. The Price aired once in its initial run, and then disappeared from syndication for years. Networks were uncomfortable showing it. Parents complained that it was too intense for children, but the episode remained in circulation through home video and word of mouth, becoming one of those legendary pieces of 80s animation that everyone heard about even if they hadn't seen it. For a generation of kids, The Price was their first encounter with the reality of drug addiction and death, and Bravestar didn't soften it, didn't make it comfortable, just showed them what happens when a kid makes a bad choice and keeps making it until there's no coming back. G.I. Joe was the show that gave us the famous rule. Every time a plane goes down, the pilot parachutes out safely. Every time a vehicle explodes, everyone walks away. The producers were very deliberately trying to insulate children from any sense of real-world consequence. Censors were the reason every G.I. Joe plane had parachuting pilots, and why the word die was avoided like profanity. So it makes what happened in the shipwreck episode even more extraordinary, because somehow past all those censors, past all those safeguards, one of the most psychologically disturbing sequences in the history of Saturday morning television made it to air completely intact. And it didn't involve a gun or a bomb. It involved a man watching his entire family melt. Shipwreck was everyone's favorite G.I. Joe character, the wisecracking naval officer who brought levity and warmth to the team. He was the kind of character you rooted for. So the writers chose him specifically for this moment, which tells you everything about what they were going for. The episode drops Shipwreck into what appears to be a peaceful domestic life. He's home, he's safe, he has his family around him, and then one by one, the people he loves begin to decay. Their faces distort. Their skin peels and liquefies. They reach for him as they dissolve into shapeless, melting horror, and there is absolutely nothing he can do. The sequence begins normally enough. Shipwreck is in his home, surrounded by his wife and kids. They're talking, laughing, being a family, and then his wife touches his shoulder and her hand leaves a mark. Not a dirty smudge, her skin literally transfers onto him. She pulls back, confused, and Shipwreck watches in mounting horror as her fingers start to drip. The animation doesn't pull away. It shows her face contorting as she realizes something is wrong. Shows her trying to speak as her jaw begins to sag and distort. Shows Shipwreck reaching for her, trying to hold her together, and his hands just sink into the melting flesh. And all the while, she's looking at him with eyes that still register fear and confusion and desperate need for help that he can't provide. Then the children start melting. One by one, they reach for Shipwreck. "Daddy, help!" And he watches them come apart, their small hands grasping at him, their voices still calling his name, even as their faces lose definition and collapse into formless masses. The sound design is what makes it truly nightmarish. Wet, organic sounds, dripping, the voices distorting as their mouths lose structure. Cartoons sometimes snuck in certain moments that were clearly designed to break impressionable minds. Shipwreck's melting family is, without question, near the very top of that list. It turned out, of course, that everything Shipwreck had experienced was an illusion, a simulation designed by Cobra to extract information from him. The synthoid duplicates that had been posing as his family simply broke down when the program ended. But that explanation doesn't make the imagery any less shattering, because the horror isn't in the why. It's in the what. In the way the animators drew those faces losing their structure. In the way the sound design captured something that no child's cartoon had any business capturing. It was essentially a body horror sequence in the middle of an afternoon kids show. The revelation that it was all fake should have been comforting. But the episode makes it clear that for Shipwreck, the damage is done. He sits in the real world after being extracted from the simulation, and his hands are shaking. His teammates try to reassure him it wasn't real. They weren't your real family, but Shipwreck can't process it, because even if they weren't real, what he experienced was real. The trauma was real, and he'll never get those images out of his head. The episode also raises disturbing questions about Shipwreck's actual family situation. Did he have a wife and kids in the real world? Or did Cobra fabricate the entire scenario based on his desires and fears? The show never answers this. We never see Shipwreck's real family, which means either he doesn't have one and just watched a fantasy version of the life he wishes he had melt in front of him, or he does have one and now every time he looks at them, he'll remember watching them die. And unlike the Optimus Prime death, which at least came packaged in the context of a big climactic battle with high stakes, this came out of nowhere. 1 minute, Shipwreck was home, safe, happy, and then everything he loved turned to liquid. For a generation of kids, that sequence didn't just disturb them. It genuinely destabilized the sense of safety that Saturday morning cartoons were supposed to provide. Other G.I. Joe episodes had dark moments. Characters getting captured, endangered, put in situations that looked dire before the inevitable last-second rescue. But this was different. This was personal horror. This was watching a character experience something so psychologically devastating that you knew he'd never fully recover. And the show acknowledged that. In later episodes, Shipwreck is more withdrawn, less quick with the jokes. Something in him broke during that simulation, and it never fully healed. The G.I. Joe franchise prided itself on being responsible, on being the show with the parachutes and the safety PSAs, and the knowing is half the battle sign-offs. And yet, somehow, it produced one of the most viscerally disturbing scenes of the entire decade. The censors got outsmarted, and the kids paid for it. What makes the scene even more disturbing in retrospect is how calculated it feels. The animation team knew exactly what they were doing. They spent time and resources rendering the melting process in explicit detail. Somebody had to draw each frame of those faces collapsing. Somebody had to design the sound effects. Multiple people had to sign off on this sequence, making it into the final episode, which means it wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was intentional. Someone decided that G.I. Joe needed to traumatize its audience, and they succeeded spectacularly. Part 4, Dungeons & Dragons, 1983. 5 kids trapped in hell with no way home. Dungeons & Dragons wasn't just a dark cartoon. It was a cartoon built on a foundation of existential horror that most children's programming wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. The premise alone was nightmare fuel. 5 kids get on a carnival ride and are transported to a medieval fantasy world ruled by monsters and magic. And then they spend 3 entire seasons trying and failing to get home. That's right, they never made it home. The show was canceled before they could resolve that storyline. So for kids watching in real time, the characters they'd spent years rooting for were left stranded in a hostile dimension forever. Just sitting with that for a moment. A children's cartoon where the heroes never escape is genuinely bleak in a way that almost no other show of the era attempted. The pilot episode establishes the stakes immediately. These aren't adventurers who chose this life. They're children, ranging from early teens down to an 8-year-old boy named Bobby, who were abducted from their world and dumped into one where everything wants to kill them. And the show makes it clear from the opening minutes that this isn't a dream, isn't temporary, and isn't something they can easily undo. The Dungeon Master appears almost immediately, and he's not what you'd expect from a guide character. He's cryptic, unhelpful, and seems almost to be enjoying their confusion and fear. He gives them magical weapons and new names: Hank the Ranger, Diana the Acrobat, Eric the Cavalier, Presto the Magician, Sheila the Thief, and Bobby the Barbarian, and then disappears, leaving them to figure everything out on their own. But the real darkness of Dungeons & Dragons wasn't just the premise. It was Venger. The primary antagonist of the series was a literal demonic sorcerer with bat wings, horns, and a voice that could curdle milk. He wanted to kill the kids, not capture them, not scare them off, kill them. And week after week, he came terrifyingly close to succeeding. Venger's design was nightmare fuel incarnate. His face was skeletal, his eyes glowed red, and his voice was provided by Peter Cullen. Yes, the same voice actor who played Optimus Prime, delivering lines with such menace that it sounded like every word was a threat. When Venger showed up, the tone of the episode shifted immediately. The music got darker, the shadows got longer, and the kids' fear became palpable. Episodes regularly featured the kids in mortal danger, separated from each other, hunted through dark forests, cornered in crumbling castles. The tone was relentless. There were moments of levity, sure, but the baseline anxiety of the show was that these children were fundamentally out of their depth in a world that wanted them dead with no clear path back to safety. One particularly brutal episode featured the group being captured by a race of sentient mushroom creatures who planned to sacrifice them to their god. The kids weren't just threatened, they were tied to stakes, surrounded by chanting mushroom people, and had to watch as a massive tentacled horror rose from the ground to consume them. They escaped, but the imagery of children being prepared for ritual sacrifice is something that should never have made it into a Saturday morning cartoon. The character of Eric, the Cavalier, became the audience surrogate for that fear. He was the one who constantly complained, who wanted to give up, who said out loud what every kid watching was thinking, "I just want to go home," and the show never let him. It never let any of them. The Dungeon Master, their supposed guide, spoke only in cryptic riddles and offered no concrete help. He was less a mentor and more a cosmic force, keeping them trapped in a game they didn't sign up for. Eric's character arc is fascinating because the show never portrayed his fear as cowardice. He was the only one being honest about their situation. They were kids. They didn't belong there. And every episode that passed was another episode away from their families, their schools, their lives. While the others tried to stay positive and focused on finding a way home, Eric was the one acknowledging the crushing weight of what had happened to them. What made Dungeons & Dragons particularly insidious was how it weaponized hope. Every few episodes, the kids would get close. They'd find a portal, they'd make a deal, they'd discover some magical artifact that might let them escape, and then it would be snatched away at the last second. That emotional whiplash, repeated across dozens of episodes, was genuinely cruel. The show trained its audience to expect disappointment. One episode featured them finding a portal home, but it would only let one person through. The group had to decide who got to leave, and the emotional devastation of that choice, of watching one person get to escape while the others remained trapped, was something the show explored with brutal honesty. In the end, none of them went through. They chose to stay together, rather than let one person abandon the others. But the fact that the option existed, that they had to seriously consider leaving each other behind, added a layer of moral complexity that children's cartoons typically avoided. And then there was Venger's relationship with the Dungeon Master. The revelation that they were connected, that Venger was the Dungeon Master's son, added a layer of mythological tragedy to the proceedings that felt completely out of place in a Saturday morning cartoon. Suddenly, this wasn't just a villain of the week show. It was a story about family, corruption, and the impossibility of redemption. Heavy stuff for kids eating cereal? The show hinted that Venger had once been good, that something had corrupted him, turned him into the monster he'd become. And the Dungeon Master, rather than helping him, rather than trying to save his son, just watched, manipulated events from the shadows, used the kids as pawns in some cosmic game between himself and Venger. The implication was clear. The Dungeon Master wasn't trying to help the kids get home, he was using them, and they were powerless to do anything but play along. The intended finale, which was scripted but never produced, would have seen the kids finally return home, but only after learning that Venger was the Dungeon Master's son and choosing to save him rather than escape. Even the happy ending was laced with moral complexity that most children's shows avoided entirely. The kids were supposed to give up their one chance at freedom to redeem a monster who had spent years trying to kill them. That script has since been released and animated by fans, giving the series some closure decades later. But for kids watching in the 80s and 90s, there was no resolution. The show just ended, the kids were still trapped, and an entire generation was left with the uncomfortable realization that sometimes stories don't get endings. Sometimes you're just stuck in the bad place forever, and nobody's coming to save you. Dungeons & Dragons ran for 3 seasons and left an entire generation of children with unresolved trauma about cartoon characters who never made it home. The show taught kids that sometimes the good guys don't win. Sometimes you're just stuck. And sometimes the people who are supposed to help you speak only in riddles and watch you suffer. Part 5. Inhumanoids, 1986. Body horror, decomposition, and pure nightmare fuel. If Dungeons & Dragons was existentially dark, Inhumanoids was viscerally dark. This was a show that took the concept of monsters and pushed it so far into body horror territory that it's genuinely shocking it aired as children's programming. The Inhumanoids weren't just scary. They were designed to be the stuff of nightmares, creatures that decomposed human flesh, swallowed people whole, and turned victims into mindless slaves. The show's primary villain was a creature called Metlar, a lava-based monster who lived underground and wanted to bring fire and destruction to the surface world. But Metlar wasn't even the worst of them. That honor belonged to Decompose, a skeletal rotting monstrosity whose power was literally in his name. He could decompose organic matter with a touch. He could turn living people into walking corpses loyal only to him. Let that sink in for a moment. A children's cartoon featured a villain whose entire power set revolved around making people rot. And the show didn't imply this. It showed it. Characters would be touched by Decompose, and their skin would begin to decay. Their eyes would go vacant, and they'd become shambling, zombified servants. For a generation of kids watching Saturday morning TV, Decompose was the monster under the bed made real. Decompose's design was deliberately repulsive. His body was a skeleton wrapped in decaying flesh, strips of rotting meat hanging from his bones. His jaw hung loose, giving him a permanent death's head grin, and his voice, wet, rattling like someone speaking through a throat full of fluid, made every word he spoke sound like a threat. When he appeared on screen, children recoiled. This wasn't a villain you could laugh at or dismiss. This was something primal and wrong. Then there was Tendril, a massive plant monster who didn't just attack people but consumed them, swallowed them whole. And the show depicted this in graphic detail. Characters would be pulled into Tendril's body and trapped inside, visible through his translucent vines, screaming and clawing to get out. It was claustrophobic, it was visceral, and it had absolutely no business being in a toy commercial, which is exactly what Inhumanoids was. Tendril's method of consumption was particularly disturbing because the victims remained conscious. They weren't killed or knocked out. They were aware the entire time, trapped in a living prison, slowly being digested. The animation showed their faces pressed against the inside of Tendril's vines, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. And Tendril would laugh, a deep, echoing sound that made it clear he enjoyed their suffering. The show was produced by Hasbro and Marvel Productions to sell action figures. But unlike Transformers or G.I. Joe, which at least maintained some tonal distance from real horror, Inhumanoids leaned all the way in. The monsters were horrifying, the stakes were apocalyptic, and the imagery was the kind of thing that wouldn't feel out of place in an R-rated horror film. One episode featured the main characters discovering an ancient civilization that had been wiped out by the Inhumanoids centuries ago, and the ruins were filled with the skeletal remains of people who'd been killed and decomposed by Decompose. A children's cartoon showed an on-screen mass grave. The heroes walked through corridors lined with bones, and the show made sure you understood exactly what you were looking at. The exploration sequence is drawn out and methodical. The Earth Corps team, the human protagonists, descends into an underground city, and at first it seems abandoned but intact. Then they start noticing details. Scratch marks on the walls, doors that have been clawed at from the inside. And then they find the bodies, hundreds of them, piled in chambers, sprawled across streets, clustered around what must have been the city's last defensible position, and all of them are in various states of decay, some reduced to skeletons, others still showing patches of desiccated flesh. The human characters, the Earth Corps team tasked with fighting the Inhumanoids, were constantly outmatched and terrified. The show didn't give them plot armor. They got hurt. They got captured. They watched their friends die. The tone was relentlessly bleak in a way that felt almost punishing. Every victory was Pyrrhic. Every battle left scars. What made Inhumanoids particularly effective as nightmare fuel was the sound design. Decompose's voice was a wet, rattling rasp. Tendril made organic squelching sounds when he moved. Metlar's roars were deep and guttural. The audio landscape of the show was designed to unsettle, and it worked. Kids could close their eyes and still be haunted by what they were hearing. The third Inhumanoid, Metlar, brought a different kind of horror. He was massive, covered in molten rock and radiated heat that could melt steel. But what made him particularly terrifying was his voice and personality. Metlar wasn't mindless. He was intelligent, articulate, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He spoke to humans the way a human might speak to insects, with casual disdain and the absolute certainty that their lives meant nothing. The show also featured a subplot involving Senator Masterson, a human politician who gets partially decomposed by Decompose and becomes a grotesque hybrid creature, half-human and half-rotting corpse who helps the Inhumanoids from within human society. A children's cartoon featured a prominent supporting character being turned into a decaying monster and then using his political position to betray humanity. That's not just dark. That's a level of cynicism about power and corruption that belonged in adult science fiction, not a toy commercial. Masterson's transformation is shown in agonizing detail. Decompose touches him, and immediately half his face begins to rot. The skin sloughs off, revealing muscle and bone beneath. Masterson screams, claws at his face, tries to scrape the decay away, but it spreads. One eye goes milky and dead. His voice becomes distorted, and through it all, he remains conscious and aware of what's happening to him. But the show doesn't stop there. Masterson survives the transformation and becomes Decompose's agent in the human world. He continues serving in the Senate, continues appearing on TV, continues shaking hands and making speeches, all while half his body is rotting and he's secretly working to bring about humanity's destruction. The other characters can see what he's become, but they can't prove it. And the show depicts the frustration and horror of knowing someone is a monster, but being unable to stop them because they operate within the system. Inhumanoids only lasted one season, 13 episodes, but those 13 episodes were enough to traumatize a significant portion of their audience. The show was too intense, too genuinely frightening, and too willing to go places that other cartoons wouldn't. It pushed past every boundary that Saturday morning television had established, and it paid the price by being canceled. But the damage was already done. Kids who watched Inhumanoids carried those images with them. Decomposed rotting face, tendrils gaping maw, the screams of people being consumed for decades. Part 6, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, The Dark That Slipped Through. He-Man is remembered as a show of pure, swaggering 80s confidence. The hero with the power sword, the castle in the sky, the tiger he rode into battle. It was Saturday morning fantasy at its most bombastic and unapologetic. But underneath all that muscle and bravado, there were moments that had no business existing in a children's cartoon. Skeletor, He-Man's villain, was literally a skull-faced sorcerer who commanded dark armies from a castle called Snake Mountain. That was the baseline, the everyday normal of the show. And from that baseline, some episodes went significantly further. Take Fisto's Forest. In this episode, a brutish man with a giant armored hand who is creatively named Fisto is caught harassing young elf boys by shooting white sticky webbing at them. While this 80s naivety is objectively funny now, it's hard to imagine it wouldn't raise network executives' eyebrows today. Whether intentional or the result of complete obliviousness from the writing room, the subtext of that episode is something that absolutely no parent wanted sitting in their child's living room. But the darkest thread running through He-Man wasn't any single episode. It was the relentless grinding weight of Skeletor's world itself. Here was a villain whose entire aesthetic was death. His face was a skull. His throne room was built to intimidate. His followers were beings of pure cruelty and malice. Episode after episode, he would come within a breath of winning, of actually destroying the heroic warriors and seizing the power of Grayskull, and kids sat with that anxiety every single week because the show was good enough to make you believe, even briefly, that he might actually do it. Skeletor's henchmen were a rogues gallery of nightmare fuel. Beastman, a savage creature controller who smelled of rot. Trapjaw, a cyborg with multiple weapon attachments where his arm and jaw should be. Triclops, a mercenary with 3 rotating eyes that could see in different spectrums. Evil-Lyn, a witch whose powers centered around illusion and psychological manipulation. These weren't comic relief villains. They were designed to be genuinely threatening, and in many episodes, they succeeded. One particularly dark episode involved a character being trapped in another dimension. A gray, lifeless void where nothing grew and time moved differently. The episode showed them wandering this wasteland, slowly losing hope, their supplies running out, their sanity fraying. And the show took its time with this. Minutes of screen time dedicated to showing a character alone, desperate, breaking down mentally, because they believed they'd never escape. When rescue finally came, the character was nearly catatonic, barely able to recognize their friends. A children's cartoon showed someone experiencing psychological trauma from isolation and played it completely straight. Another episode featured Skeletor successfully capturing Castle Grayskull and sitting on the throne of power. For a brief moment, he'd won. He had everything he'd been fighting for, and the episode showed what that looked like. The castle corrupted, its walls turning dark, its magic twisted into something evil. He-Man and the others had to watch their home, the seat of all good in Eternia, fall to darkness. They got it back, but the image of Skeletor triumphant, of everything they fought to protect being violated, was deeply unsettling for young viewers. He-Man is one of the most well-remembered cartoons of the 80s, but without revisiting the show in adult years, the barely concealed aspects of the world of Eternia probably only reached the subconscious as a kid. There was something deeply strange about the world the show built. All these hyper-muscled characters in minimal clothing wielding magical weapons, and the strange villain schemes that adults watching alongside their children felt viscerally but couldn't quite articulate. The kids, mercifully, were mostly oblivious, but it was there. What makes He-Man's darkness particularly interesting is how it operated on two levels simultaneously. On the surface, it was bright and cheerful. He-Man won every week, the moral lesson played at the end, everything resolved cleanly. But underneath that surface ran genuine menace. Real threat. A villain whose name literally meant the threat of death, whose aesthetic was built from bones and darkness, and whose defining characteristic was the unrelenting desire to destroy everything good. That's a lot to plant in a child's mind, and then tell them to go to bed. The transformation sequence itself carried disturbing implications if you thought about it too hard. Prince Adam, a seemingly weak, ineffectual young man, had to become someone else entirely to be a hero. He had to abandon his identity, his personality, even his appearance to be worthy of fighting evil. And the show never interrogated what that meant for Adam's sense of self. Was He-Man who he truly was, and Adam just a disguise? Or was Adam real, and He-Man the mask? For children watching, the message could easily be interpreted as, you're not good enough as you are. You need to become someone else. Part 7, Thundercats, The Garden of Delights, drug addiction, hidden inside a fantasy epic. Thundercats gave the 80s one of its most enduring battle cries, and one of its most legitimately unsettling episodes. If you ever watched He-Man and thought it needed more cats, Thundercats was the show for you. Unsurprisingly, for a series about feline humanoid aliens with magic swords and spaceships, it's filled with plenty of weird moments. PSAs from Lion-O about the dangers of underage drinking were aired alongside episodes like The Garden of Delights, which way overstepped its anti-drug educational remit. In the episode, Mumm-Ra disguises himself as a creepy baby plant fairy to get Tigra hooked on a mind-altering fruit, resulting in him hallucinating about flying. So let's sit with that for a moment. The villain of Thundercats, an ancient, mummified, evil sorcerer, disguised himself as a cute baby fairy to lure one of the heroes into eating a hallucinogenic fruit, which he then became addicted to. That's a drug dealer. That is exactly the dynamic of a drug dealer. The friendly approach, the free sample, the slow hook, portrayed in vivid animated detail in a show aimed at children. And because it was wrapped in the language of fantasy, it slipped through without the same scrutiny that a more realistic depiction would have attracted. The episode opens with Tigra discovering a lush garden filled with beautiful glowing fruit. A small fairy appears, cute, innocent, offering him a sample. Just one taste, the fairy says. It'll make you feel amazing. And Tigra, who should know better, eats it. The immediate effect is euphoria. He's stronger, faster, can do things he couldn't before. The animation shows him leaping through the air, laughing, exhilarated, and the fairy watches with a smile that doesn't quite reach its eyes. Tigra, the architect, the cool-headed scientist of the Thundercats, becomes a hollow, twitching shadow of himself under the influence of the fruit. He lies to the other Thundercats. He sneaks away to get more. He becomes irritable and volatile when he can't have it. The show depicted the full arc of addiction with a clarity that was genuinely confronting, and the fact that it was happening to one of the most composed and respected members of the team made it worse. If Tigra could fall, anyone could fall. One scene shows Tigra in withdrawal, and the animation doesn't hold back. He's sweating, shaking, his eyes darting around looking for an escape. His claws are unsheathed, scratching at his arms at the walls. The other Thundercats try to help him, but he lashes out, attacks them, driven purely by the need to get more of the fruit. For a children's show, this was an unflinching portrayal of addiction's grip. The reveal that the fairy is actually Mumm-Ra in disguise comes late in the episode, and by that point, the damage is done. Tigra is already hooked, already dependent, and even after Mumm-Ra is defeated and the garden destroyed, Tigra has to live with what happened. The episode ends with him clean but shaken, and the other Thundercats watching him carefully, knowing he came close to losing himself completely. The show's mix of slapstick humor and dark villainy created a unique tone, but the intensity of Mum-Ra in episodes like this often felt out of place in an otherwise light-hearted series. For many kids, he was the stuff of nightmares. Mum-Ra's design alone, a shriveled, bandaged corpse that could transform into a towering, muscle-bound demon with glowing red eyes, was the kind of thing that lodged in a child's imagination and refused to leave. The fact that this monster was also capable of disguising himself as something small and sweet and approachable made him genuinely terrifying in a different way. You couldn't even trust something that looked friendly, and for a generation of children watching Thundercats, that lesson arrived wrapped in animation and a catchy theme song before they were old enough to understand what it meant. Mum-Ra's transformation sequence was shown in nearly every episode, and it never got less disturbing. He'd start as the decrepit mummy, barely able to move, wheezing and weak. Then he'd call upon the ancient spirits of evil, and his body would convulse. Muscles would bulge, skin would tighten, and the frail old corpse would become a towering figure of pure malevolence. The message was clear. Evil could hide its true nature until it was too late to run. The drug allegory in the Garden of Delights was almost certainly intentional. The show, like many of its contemporaries, was threading serious social commentary into its fantasy framework, using the distance of science fiction and mythology to discuss things that would have been considered inappropriate if depicted directly. But the effect on children watching it wasn't abstract, it was visceral. Watching a hero they loved crumble under the influence of something he couldn't control hit differently than any after-school special ever could, because they were already invested. They already cared about Tigra, and the show used that care against them. Beyond the Garden of Delights, Thundercats had other moments of genuine darkness. One episode featured a character being aged rapidly by Mum-Ra's magic, going from young and vital to elderly and frail in minutes. The animation showed the process in detail, skin wrinkling, hair graying, movements becoming slow and pained. For a child watching, this was a confrontation with mortality they weren't prepared for. The character was saved, but the episode planted the seed that time would eventually do this to everyone. Magic or not, My Little Pony, Pastel Horses, Rainbow Manes, a show built from the ground up to be the gentlest, most inoffensive children's entertainment imaginable. And then the very first episode, the very first thing ever produced under the My Little Pony banner, introduced a demon. The 1984 TV special, the first ever My Little Pony cartoon, introduced the world to a group of adorable magical horses who were living in hoof-quaking fear of being enslaved by a giant, satanic centaur called Tyrek, and forced to pull his chariot of darkness. Tyrek, not a witch, not a mean older sibling, not a bully pony with a bad attitude, a towering, horned, demonic centaur whose entire existence was built around enslaving the innocent and dragging them into eternal darkness. Tyrek, the angry horned centaur thing, had a raspy, terrifying voice, and this emissary of Satan sent out dragons and lizard men to kidnap unsuspecting ponies. He transformed the ponies he captured into monstrous, zombie-like dragon creatures called nightmares, stripped of their color, their personality, their freedom, and harnessed them to pull a chariot that would bring permanent darkness to the world. The transformation sequence is shown multiple times, and each time it's horrifying. A pony is dragged before Tyrek, screaming and struggling. He raises his hands, dark energy crackles, and the pony begins to change. Their coat turns gray, their eyes go red and vacant. Their body distorts into something reptilian and wrong, and all the while they're conscious, aware of what's happening, unable to stop it. The other ponies can only watch in horror as their friends are corrupted and enslaved. Now think about what you're actually watching when you strip away the cartoon aesthetic. You have innocent creatures being abducted against their will. You have a villain who physically transforms his victims into something unrecognizable. You have a villain whose goal is literally the end of all light and joy in the world, and it's all presented in graphic, unambiguous animated detail. The faces of the corrupted ponies, the eerie glow of the chariot, the screaming terror of the characters before they're taken. Unlike every other cartoon based on a toy line, My Little Pony had no pre-designated villains, leaving the writers to constantly devise new ones. Some of these antagonists weren't so threatening. Think giant cartoon squids and overweight witches. The first ever pony villain, however, was a demon overlord. There's a reasonable argument to be made that this tonal mismatch, the gap between what My Little Pony was supposed to be and what Rescue at Midnight Castle actually delivered, is what made it so effective as nightmare fuel. Children came in expecting something warm and safe, because every piece of marketing around My Little Pony pointed toward warmth and safety, and then Tyrek showed up, and whatever safety they thought they had evaporated instantly. The special also introduced Spike the Dragon, but not as the cute baby dragon from later iterations. This Spike was a captive, enslaved by Tyrek, forced to assist in capturing ponies. When he first appears, he's terrified, flinching at every sound, clearly traumatized by his time in Tyrek's service. A children's special opened with a character already broken by abuse, and the show made sure you understood what that meant. The special set a precedent. Later seasons of My Little Pony continued to find villains with genuine menace. The Smooze, a dark fluid that smothered everything it touched. The Lavon, a creature of living lava, but none of them hit quite the same way as Tyrek, because Tyrek came first. He was the ambush. He was the moment the show broke its own promise about what it was going to be, before children had even had the chance to form that expectation fully. For a 5-year-old sitting alone in front of the TV, expecting ponies and rainbows, Tyrek wasn't just too dark. He was a genuine encounter with something that felt ancient and wrong and merciless. Exactly the kind of thing you never expect from a cartoon about magical horses. The defeat of Tyrek should have been triumphant, but the special frames it as barely avoiding catastrophe. The ponies win through a combination of luck, desperation, and the help of a human girl named Megan, who gets pulled into their world. But the victory feels fragile. Tyrek isn't destroyed, just banished, and the implication is clear: he could come back. The darkness is always lurking at the edges of their world, waiting for another chance. Here's one that sounds too absurd to be real. The Smurfs, the chirpy singing little blue creatures of the Belgian forest, produced a Christmas special that involved an antagonist buying 2 orphaned children from Gargamel, and then using them in a fiery satanic-looking ritual to open a portal to their final journey. That's not a summary from a horror film. That's a children's Christmas special, aired in 1982 on network television. The episode features an antagonist known as the Christmas Stranger, which already sounds like the name of a holiday horror film, who is sold 2 orphaned, homeless kids by Gargamel. Child slavery in a Christmas special. The man then uses the children in a fiery, satanic-looking ritual that he hopes will open a portal to their final journey. The setup is almost casual in how disturbing it is. Gargamel captures 2 children, a boy and a girl, both young, both already traumatized by being orphans on the streets. He keeps them in a cage, complains about having to feed them, and then this stranger arrives, dressed in dark robes, offering Gargamel gold in exchange for the children. Gargamel doesn't hesitate, doesn't ask what the stranger wants them for, just takes the money and hands over 2 human children like they're livestock. The Christmas Stranger is, in every meaningful sense, a figure meant to evoke the devil in disguise. A cold, manipulative presence who hides behind the language of seasonal goodwill while engineering the damnation of 2 innocent children. Gargamel, the show's designated villain, happily sells those children to him. The word sells. These are children being sold in a Christmas special. The ritual sequence is where the special crosses from dark into genuinely disturbing. The stranger takes the children to a stone circle surrounded by flames. He begins chanting in a language that sounds ancient and wrong. The children are placed at the center, crying, begging to be let go, while the flames grow higher and the air shimmers with heat. A portal begins to open, a swirling vortex of red and black, and the stranger prepares to shove the children through. The devil in disguise leads the children toward a fiery portal, while chanting in what can only be described as ritualistic language. Luckily, the Smurfs show up and sing at him until he disappears, screaming in agony. The resolution is, at least, appropriately absurd. Papa Smurf and company arrive, and the power of Christmas singing drives the demonic entity away. But the damage is done long before the Smurfs turn up. The imagery of those children being dragged toward a fiery portal, the cold authority with which the stranger commands the scene, the wholesale transaction of two young lives between what amounts to two different varieties of evil. None of that is softened by the musical finale. What makes this particularly baffling is that this was supposed to be a feel-good Christmas special, the kind of thing families watch together while decorating the tree and drinking hot cocoa. And somebody decided that the best plot for this wholesome holiday content was child trafficking and demonic sacrifice. Someone wrote that script. Multiple people approved it. Animators drew it. Voice actors recorded lines about selling children. And nobody along the way thought, maybe this isn't appropriate for a Christmas special aimed at preschoolers. The Smurfs Christmas special is perhaps the most jaw-dropping example of darkness in 80s cartoons. Not because it was uniquely evil, but because the contrast between what the show was supposed to represent and what it actually put on screen was so extreme. This was the Smurfs, Papa Smurf and Brainy Smurf and Clumsy Smurf, the cutest franchise in Saturday morning television, and they did a child slavery episode for Christmas. No parent sitting down to watch a festive Smurfs special with their toddler was prepared for the Christmas stranger. No network executive apparently read the script carefully enough to flag it, and so it aired, and a generation of small children sat and watched two orphans get auctioned off to what was unmistakably a figure of pure evil, dressed up in winter aesthetics and broadcast as family entertainment. The special has since become infamous among animation historians and traumatized adults who remember watching it as children. It's regularly cited as one of the most inappropriate moments in children's television, and for good reason. Nothing about it was okay. Not the slavery, not the ritual, not the casual way Gargamel handed over two human lives for profit. It was all deeply wrong, and the fact that it was wrapped in a Christmas special makes it worse somehow. The Real Ghostbusters. When the comedy show became pure horror, The Real Ghostbusters started as a spin-off of the 1984 film, bringing the ghost hunting team to Saturday morning television. But what started as a relatively lighthearted comedy about four guys catching ghosts quickly evolved into something far more disturbing. The show didn't just feature ghosts, it featured body horror, psychological torture, and entities that were genuinely terrifying in ways that had nothing to do with comedy. Take the episode The Collect Call of Cthulhu, a children's cartoon that directly adapted the cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft. The episode featured Cthulhu, the Great Old One, an ancient godlike entity whose very existence was anathema to human sanity, and the show didn't water this down. Characters who looked at Cthulhu began to lose their minds. The animation depicted people's faces contorting in terror, their eyes going wide with madness, their bodies trembling as their grip on reality slipped away. For a generation of kids, this was their first encounter with Lovecraftian horror, and it was served to them on Saturday morning alongside a bowl of cereal. The episode takes Lovecraft's core concept that there are things in the universe so vast and alien that simply perceiving them breaks the human mind, and presents it in animated form. Cthulhu isn't defeated through proton packs or clever plans. He's defeated through sheer luck and desperation. And the implication is clear that if he'd wanted to, he could have destroyed everyone without effort. The Ghostbusters survived not because they were strong, but because they were beneath notice. Then there was The Boogeyman Cometh, an episode that took a childhood fear and made it literal. The Boogeyman wasn't just a scary story. He was real, and he lived in a dimension that could be accessed through any closet or dark space. The episode showed children being dragged into this nightmare realm, screaming and clawing as they disappeared into shadow. The Boogeyman himself was designed to be the physical manifestation of terror, all sharp angles, glowing eyes, and a voice that dripped with malice. The Boogeyman's dimension was pure nightmare fuel. Dark corridors that shifted and changed. Stairs that led nowhere. Rooms where the walls breathed and the shadows moved independently. And scattered throughout were the toys and belongings of the children he'd taken over the years. Abandoned teddy bears, broken bikes, photos of families these kids would never see again. The implication was clear. The Boogeyman had been doing this for a long time, and most of his victims were never rescued. The show also featured episodes where the Ghostbusters themselves were possessed, transformed, or psychologically broken. The Devil to Pay had the team facing off against a literal demon who claimed ownership of one of their souls. Ragnarok and Roll featured the Norse end-of-the-world scenario playing out in modern New York, complete with the apocalypse and gods dying on screen. What made the real Ghostbusters particularly insidious was that it started friendly. The first season was relatively tame. Ghosts would appear, the team would catch them, everyone would crack jokes, and it would all wrap up neatly. But as the show went on, the writers got bolder, the ghosts got scarier, the stakes got higher, and the imagery got significantly more disturbing. Episodes would feature people melting, people being turned inside out, people being erased from existence. All of this animated in vivid, uncomfortable detail. The sound design was equally nightmarish. Wet, squelching sounds, bone-breaking cracks, screams that felt far too realistic for a children's cartoon. One episode featured a ghost that fed on fear, and the only way to stop it was to stop being afraid. Simple premise. But the execution showed each Ghostbuster being forced to confront their deepest terrors, being buried alive, losing their friends, becoming the monster they hunt. For a children's show, the level of psychological horror was extraordinary. These weren't physical threats. These were existential ones. And watching the characters break down under the weight of their own fears was genuinely distressing. The show also had a recurring antagonist in Soundfine, a spirit representing Halloween itself. His design was grotesque, a massive pumpkin-headed creature in dark robes who commanded legions of monsters. His voice was deep and resonant, filled with an authority that made it clear he was not a villain to be mocked. He was ancient, powerful, and utterly indifferent to human suffering, and he appeared in multiple episodes, each time bringing a new wave of nightmare fuel. One particularly disturbing episode, When Halloween Was Forever, saw Simon actually succeed in his plan, turning every day into Halloween, transforming the world into a permanent state of supernatural chaos. The Ghostbusters had to watch as reality itself warped around them. People transforming into monsters, the sky turning perpetually dark. For a children's show, the imagery of total societal collapse was genuinely unsettling. Simon's victory wasn't just a Halloween gimmick. The episode showed what it meant. People losing their identities, becoming the costumes they wore. A man in a werewolf costume becomes an actual werewolf, his human mind still trapped inside as his body changes and his instincts turn predatory. A child in a ghost costume begins to fade from existence, becoming incorporeal, able to see and hear, but unable to interact with the physical world. The Ghostbusters reversed it, but the implication lingered. This could happen. Reality is more fragile than you think. The real Ghostbusters proved that you could take a comedic premise and push it into genuinely dark territory if you were willing to commit. The show respected its young audience enough to give them real scares, real stakes, and real nightmares. And for kids who grew up watching it, those nightmares stuck. The Adventures of the Galaxy Rangers, 1986, space westerns with body horror and slavery. The Adventures of the Galaxy Rangers looked, at first glance, like every other syndicated space cartoon of the era. Heroes with special powers, spaceships, aliens, a catchy theme song. But underneath that familiar surface, this was one of the strangest and darkest shows of the entire decade. It tackled slavery, addiction, body horror, and moral despair, and it did all of it on weekday afternoons aimed squarely at children. The premise was already heavier than most. The Galaxy Rangers were humans whose bodies had been surgically altered, given implants that granted them special abilities. They had to keep their powers in check because using them too much could overwhelm them. So right from the start, the show was about people whose own bodies had been changed without fully belonging to them anymore, who had to live with the constant risk of their abilities consuming them. That is a heavy idea to hand a child, dressed up as a superpower. But the show went much further than that. One of the most disturbing recurring elements involved a villain race called the Slaver Lords, beings who captured living creatures and harvested them. The show did not soften what these creatures did. They enslaved entire populations. They used a substance to control their captives, keeping them docile and obedient. And the heroes spent episodes confronting the reality that across the galaxy, sentient beings were being bought, sold, and broken on an industrial scale. A cartoon for kids built an entire villain faction around the systematic enslavement of living people. The most infamous element of the show was a character named Captain Kidd, and the broader theme of the Queen of the Crown, the show's main villain. The Queen ruled through a substance called the Slaver Crown, a device she could place on a victim's head that drained their will and turned them into a mindless servant. The animation showed this process clearly. A free-thinking person would have the crown forced onto them. Their eyes would go blank. Their posture would slump, and whatever made them a person would simply drain away. They became property, and the show made you watch it happen. What made the Galaxy Rangers particularly unsettling was how it refused to give easy victories. The heroes could not save everyone. They would arrive at a world only to find it already stripped, already enslaved, already lost. They would rescue a handful of captives while knowing that countless others remained in chains. The show was honest about the limits of heroism in a way that almost no other children's program dared to be. Sometimes you show up and you're too late, and you carry that with you. There was also a strong thread of addiction running through the series. The substance used to control slaves worked like a drug. Victims became dependent on it, and freeing them meant forcing them through a withdrawal that the show did not shy away from depicting. Characters would shake, beg, and break down as the substance left their systems. The heroes had to hold them through it, knowing that the kindest thing and the cruelest thing were the same thing. For a weekday afternoon cartoon, this was an extraordinarily mature and grim portrayal of dependency and recovery. The visual design leaned into horror as well. The Queen of the Crown was a genuinely frightening figure, cold and regal, and utterly without mercy. Her servants were grotesque. The worlds the Rangers visited were often bleak, ruined places that had already been hollowed out by the slavers. The color palette was darker than the bright primaries of most toy cartoons, and the tone matched it. This was a show about a galaxy where terrible things happened constantly, and the heroes could only ever hold back a fraction of the darkness. One episode dealt with a character discovering the truth about their own past, learning that people they trusted had been complicit in the slaver system. The betrayal was personal, and the show let it land. There was no quick reassurance, no neat moral that wrapped everything up. The character had to absorb the fact that the world was more corrupt and more compromised than they had believed, and they had to keep fighting anyway. That is a heavy lesson for a child, delivered without any cushioning. The Galaxy Rangers also did not protect its audience from the consequences of violence the way most of its peers did. People were genuinely hurt. The threat felt real. When a ranger was in danger, the show made you believe they might not walk away unscathed. There was a weight to the stakes that came from the series, treating its own world as a place where suffering was real and permanent. The Slaver Crown deserves particular attention. Because of all the dark devices in 80s cartoons, few were as disturbing in concept. It was a tool for the theft of the self. When the Queen placed it on a victim, she was not killing them or imprisoning their body. She was reaching into their mind and scooping out everything that made them who they were, replacing it with obedience. The show let the audience see the before and the after, the free person and the hollow servant, and the contrast was deeply unsettling. A child watching could understand on some level that the worst thing that could happen to you was not death. It was the erasure of yourself while your body kept walking around, serving someone who had stolen your will. That idea, delivered through a space cartoon, was one of the heavier concepts any 80s show dared to present. The show only ran for a single season of 65 episodes, the standard syndication package of the era, and then it was gone. It never got the toy line it was designed to support off the ground in a meaningful way, and without merchandise sales, there was no reason to continue. But the episodes that exist remain some of the most thematically daring of the decade. The series tackled slavery, addiction, betrayal, and the limits of heroism with a seriousness that its bright, animated surface completely disguised. There is also the matter of how the show handled its heroes. The Galaxy Rangers were not invulnerable saviors who breezed through every challenge. They were altered people, carrying their own burdens, fighting a war that wore them down. The show let them struggle, let them fail, let them feel the weight of what they could not fix. That made them more human and more relatable, but it also made the world feel more dangerous. If even the heroes were strained and overwhelmed, What hope did the ordinary people of the galaxy have? The series never offered the comfortable reassurance that the good guys had everything under control. They did not. They were barely holding on. For the kids who watched it, the Galaxy Rangers lodged in memory precisely because it did not feel safe. It felt like the universe was a genuinely dangerous place, full of beings who would strip away your freedom and your mind if they got the chance, and that the heroes standing against them were outnumbered and overwhelmed. That feeling planted in a child watching after school did not fade easily. It taught a generation that not every story has enough heroes to save everyone, and that some evils are simply too vast to fully defeat. The show treated its young audience as people who could handle a hard truth, and the hard truth it offered was that the galaxy was a cruel place, where freedom was fragile and could be taken in an instant. That lesson, wrapped in a space western with a catchy theme song, settled deep into the children who absorbed it. The Care Bears were engineered from the ground up to be the safest, warmest, most comforting characters in the history of children's entertainment. They were pastel bears who lived in the clouds and solved problems with hugs and feelings. Their entire brand was emotional safety, so it remains genuinely shocking that their first feature film built its plot around a demonic book that grooms a lonely child into serving evil. The Care Bears movie introduced a villain that was not a bear, not a creature, not a person at all. It was a book, an ancient, sinister spellbook with a face on its cover, a face that moved and spoke and schemed. The book had been locked away, and it spent the film working to corrupt vulnerable children and spread misery across the world. A talking, malevolent book that wants to fill the world with darkness is a frightening enough concept on its own. What the film did with it was worse. The book's chosen target was a boy named Nicholas, a lonely orphan working as a magician's assistant. Nicholas had no friends, no family, and no one who paid him any attention. He was exactly the kind of isolated, hurting child who is most vulnerable, and the book knew it. The book approached Nicholas not with threats, but with offers. It promised him friendship. It promised him that people would finally notice him. It told him it understood him when no one else did, and slowly, patiently, it drew him in. If that pattern sounds familiar, it should. It is, almost exactly, the pattern of how predators target isolated children. The book identified a lonely kid, offered him the emotional connection he desperately craved, and used that craving to pull him toward doing terrible things. The film, a Care Bears film, depicted the grooming of a vulnerable child in clear and recognizable detail. It just dressed it up as a magic spellbook. As Nicholas falls deeper under the book's influence, his appearance changes. He grows paler. His eyes darken. His expression becomes cold and distant. The warm, sad boy from the beginning of the film is replaced by a hollow servant of the book's will. The transformation is gradual and visible, and it is genuinely unsettling to watch a child character, drained of his humanity scene by scene. He begins working to spread the book's darkness, to make people stop caring about one another, because the book has convinced him that caring only leads to pain. The film's central threat is the spread of that emotional coldness across the entire world. The book's goal is a world where no one cares about anyone, where kindness is gone, and cruelty is normal. And as Nicholas spreads its influence, the film shows the world growing darker and colder, people turning on each other, the warmth draining out of everything. For a Care Bears film, the imagery is bleak. A world losing its capacity to love is a genuinely disturbing thing to depict, especially for the youngest viewers who made up the audience. There are sequences in the film that lean fully into horror. The book's lair is dark and threatening. When the book exerts its full power, the visuals turn nightmarish, full of shadow and menace and swirling darkness. The Care Bears themselves are placed in real peril, and the film does not pretend they are guaranteed to win. There is a sequence where they are nearly lost, where the darkness nearly consumes them, and the outcome feels genuinely uncertain. What makes the film land so heavily is the emotional truth at its center. Nicholas is not evil. He is a lonely, hurting child who was preyed upon because no one was there to protect him. The film is, underneath everything, about how isolation makes children vulnerable, and about how the antidote is genuine connection. That is a real and important message. But the way the film delivers it, by actually showing a child being groomed and corrupted, was far heavier than anything the Care Bears brand had prepared its audience for. The resolution comes when the Care Bears reach Nicholas not with force, but with care. They show him that he is not alone, that he is loved, that the book lied to him about everything. And in the end, the connection he was offered freely breaks the hold the book had on him through manipulation. It is a genuinely moving ending, but getting there required taking small children through a story about a malevolent entity hollowing out a lonely boy, and that journey left a mark. It is also worth recognizing how the film inverted the entire premise of the Care Bears brand. The bears existed to care, to feel, to connect. Their power came from emotion, and the villain the film created was the perfect opposite of everything they stood for. A force that wanted to eliminate caring entirely, to make the world cold and indifferent. The conflict was not just good versus evil, it was caring versus not caring, connection versus isolation, warmth versus emptiness. By building its villain as the literal enemy of feeling, the film raised the stakes to something genuinely existential. What was being threatened was not just the characters' lives, but the very capacity of the world to love. For the youngest viewers, the idea of a world where no one cared about anyone was a quietly terrifying thing to contemplate. For a generation of children who sat down expecting a gentle film about hugging bears, the Care Bears movie delivered something far stranger and darker. The talking book with the moving face became a fixture of childhood nightmares, the image of Nicholas growing pale and cold stuck in young minds, and the underlying lesson that loneliness makes children targets, and that there are forces in the world that prey on the vulnerable settled into a generation of viewers who were far too young to process it consciously, but old enough to feel it. The film meant well, and its ultimate message about the healing power of genuine connection was a beautiful one. But the road to that message ran straight through the corruption of a lonely child, and that journey was heavier and more frightening than anything the cheerful, pastel branding had prepared its audience to expect. Part 13. Rainbow Brite, 1984, Stolen Children and a World Drained of Color. Rainbow Brite was sold as the brightest, most colorful concept imaginable. A young girl who brings color to the world, surrounded by tiny horse-like sprites, and a flying horse named Starlight, living in a land of rainbows. The merchandise was relentlessly cheerful. The whole point of the brand was joy and color, which makes the actual origin story and the darkness woven through the show genuinely surprising. The Rainbow Brite story begins not with joy, but with a grim, frightening world. In the original special that introduced her, a young girl named Wisp arrives in a place gripped by perpetual gloom. The land is gray, cold, and lifeless, drained of all color, trapped in a darkness that has lasted far too long, and the creatures who live there are suffering under it. This is the starting point for what was marketed as the happiest girls cartoon of the decade. A world so far gone that it has forgotten what color even looks like. Wisp discovers that small creatures called Color Kids have been imprisoned. They have been captured and locked away by the forces of darkness, and as long as they remain prisoners, the world cannot have color. So the opening story of Rainbow Brite is, at its core, about a child discovering that other children have been kidnapped and held captive, and taking it upon herself to free them. That is a much darker setup than the rainbow branding ever suggested. The villains of Rainbow Brite were genuinely menacing. The primary antagonist, Murky Dismal, ruled over the gloom and actively worked to keep the world gray and miserable. His name said it all. He wanted dismalness. He wanted to smother color and joy wherever it appeared. He was assisted by a bumbling henchman, which gave the show some comic relief, but Murky's actual goal, a world permanently drained of all light and happiness, was bleak at its foundation. Even more frightening was a creature from the early story, a monstrous being that served the darkness. In the original special, Wisp encounters a terrifying creature in the depths of the gloomy world, a genuinely scary monster that menaces her in the dark. For young viewers, this sequence, a small child alone in a lightless, dead world, pursued by a monster, was the stuff of nightmares. The show that was supposed to be about rainbows opened with a child lost and hunted in the dark. The concept of the Color Kids being imprisoned carried disturbing weight. These were childlike beings who had been locked away, robbed of their freedom, kept as captives by a villain who wanted to use their absence to control the world. When Wisp frees them, the show depicts their joy and relief, but it also makes clear how long they suffered and how close the world came to staying gray forever. The threat of permanent imprisonment hung over the story. There was also the larger existential idea at the heart of the show. Rainbow Bright was responsible for bringing color to the entire world. If she failed, if the villains won, the world would lose its color permanently. That is an enormous burden to place on a child character, and by extension on the children watching. The fate of all beauty and joy rested on a young girl's shoulders, and the villains were constantly scheming to take it from her. The stakes were nothing less than the death of color itself. The villains' methods were often cruel. Murky and his forces would try to capture the sprites, the small creatures who mined the color crystals that made color possible. They would try to steal the source of all color and hoard it. They would try to spread their gloom to lands that were still bright. Episode after episode, the show returned to this fundamental conflict between those who wanted a world of color and joy, and those who actively, deliberately wanted to extinguish it. What made Rainbow Bright effective and unsettling was that the darkness was not incidental. It was the entire premise. The show existed because the world was under threat from forces that wanted to drain away everything good. Rainbow Bright was not a happy girl in a happy world. She was a child standing between the world and permanent darkness, constantly fending off villains who would gladly trap her friends and smother all color forever. It is worth dwelling on how completely the marketing concealed all of this. The Rainbow Bright toys, the lunch boxes, the bed sheets, the endless merchandise, all of it radiated pure cheerfulness. A smiling girl with rainbow-striped sleeves and a flying horse. Nothing about the products hinted that the actual story behind them involved a dead gray world, imprisoned children, and a monster hunting a little girl in the dark. Parents bought the toys expecting nothing but sweetness, and then they sat their children down in front of the special and watched alongside them as the Rainbow Girl's origin turned out to be a journey through a land of gloom, fear, and captivity. The gap between the brand and the story was enormous, and that gap was exactly what made the Darkness Land so hard. For children watching, the bright surface of Rainbow Bright sat on top of some genuinely heavy ideas. Other children imprisoned, a world drained of life, monsters in the dark, a villain whose only goal was misery. The toys were cheerful and the theme song was upbeat, but the actual story was about a small girl trying to hold back an encroaching darkness that wanted to swallow everything, and the early monster sequences. The imagery of the gray, dead world stayed with the kids who saw them long after the rainbows faded from memory. The lesson buried in all that color was a surprisingly bleak one. That joy and brightness are not the natural state of things, that they have to be fought for and protected, and that there are forces in the world working constantly to drain them away. For a brand built entirely on cheerfulness, that was a strikingly dark foundation, and the children who watched felt it even if they could not name it. Visionaries' Knights of the Magical Light was one of the last great toy-driven cartoons of the decade, and it remains one of the most fascinating because of how genuinely dark and strange its premise was. Most toy cartoons imagined a bright future of technology and adventure. Visionaries imagined the opposite. It was a story about a world where all technology suddenly permanently died, plunging an advanced civilization back into a brutal age of magic and survival. The setup is genuinely apocalyptic. On the planet Prismos, 3 suns align in a rare event, and when they do, all technology stops working. Forever. Machines go dead. Vehicles stop. The advanced, comfortable civilization the people of Prismos had built collapses in an instant, and there is no fixing it. The age of science is simply over, replaced by an age of magic. The show opens with the literal end of the world, as its characters knew it. Think about what that actually means for the people living through it. Everything they relied on is gone. The infrastructure that kept them fed, warm, and safe has died, and the show does not pretend this transition is easy or bloodless. It depicts a society descending into chaos and desperation, as people realize that the world they knew is gone and is never coming back. There are scenes of social collapse, of people fighting over resources, of the comfortable order of civilization breaking down into something harsher and more violent. In this collapsed world, the characters must learn magic to survive, because magic is all that works now. They gain the ability to transform and to summon magical powers, but these powers come from a world that has been thrown into darkness and scarcity. The heroes, the Spectral Knights, and the villains, the Darkling Lords, are not fighting over a bright future. They are fighting over the scraps of a fallen world, trying to establish who will rule in the new age of magic. The Darkling Lords were genuinely sinister antagonists. They embraced the darkness of the new world, drawing their power from cruelty and selfishness. Their leader, Darkstorm, was a cold and ruthless figure who wanted to dominate the ruined planet entirely. The animal forms the characters could transform into reflected their natures, and the Darkling Lords took the forms of predators and scavengers, creatures of the night and of death. Their whole aesthetic was built around menace and decay. What set Visionaries apart was the sheer bleakness of its world. This was not a fun adventure in a magical land. It was a survival story set in the aftermath of an apocalypse. The characters lived in a world that had lost almost everything, where the old certainties were gone, and magic was unpredictable and dangerous. The tone was somber and often grim, far heavier than the bright optimism of most of its contemporaries. The magic itself carried a cost and a danger. Using power drained the user. The spells could fail or backfire, and the world the characters moved through was full of threats, ruined places, and the lingering trauma of the Great Collapse. The show treated magic not as a wondrous gift, but as a harsh necessity in a world where the alternative was death. There was nothing whimsical about it. One of the most disturbing aspects of the show was its honesty about loss. The civilization that died at the start of the series did not come back. The comforts and certainties were gone for good. The characters had to build a new life in the rubble of the old one, and the show never offered the false hope that things would simply return to normal. The apocalypse was permanent. That refusal to undo the catastrophe gave the series a weight that most children's programming carefully avoided. The conflict between the Spectral Knights and the Darkling Lords was a fight for the soul of the new world. Would it be ruled by those who valued honor and cooperation, or by those who embraced cruelty and domination? And the show made clear that the outcome was genuinely in doubt. The Darkling Lords were powerful and ruthless, and they came close to winning more than once. The darkness was not a foregone defeat. It was a real and present danger that could have swallowed everything. Visionaries only lasted 13 episodes before it was canceled, the victim of a declining market for toy-driven cartoons. But in those 13 episodes, it built one of the most genuinely apocalyptic and somber worlds in all of 80s animation. It asked children to imagine the total collapse of civilization, the death of everything familiar, and the desperate struggle to survive in the ruins. For a show built to sell action figures with light-up holographic chest emblems, it carried a remarkably heavy and frightening vision of what happens when the world as you know it simply ends. For the kids who watched, that core idea lingered. The notion that everything could just stop, that the comfortable world could collapse in an instant and never recover, was a deeply unsettling thing to plant in a young mind. Visionaries did not traumatize through gore or monsters. It traumatized through the quiet, creeping dread of an apocalypse that could not be undone. And there was something especially modern and frightening about the specific way the world ended. It was not destroyed by war or by a monster. It was switched off. The technology that everyone depended on simply stopped, all at once, and with it went every comfort and certainty of modern life. For children who lived in a world increasingly dependent on machines and electricity, the idea that all of it could just fail permanently, with no warning and no fix, was a uniquely unsettling kind of fear. The show asked them to imagine their own comfortable world going dark and never coming back, and that question lingered long after the credits rolled. Spiral Zone is one of the most overlooked dark cartoons of the 80s and one of the most genuinely frightening in its core premise. Where most toy cartoons imagined a conflict between good guys and bad guys with the world basically intact, Spiral Zone imagined something far more disturbing. It imagined that a villain had already won across a huge portion of the planet, and that hundreds of millions of people were already enslaved, their minds already taken, before the story even began. The setup is grim. A villain known as the Overlord has unleashed a weapon that creates the Spiral Zone, an expanding region of the Earth covered by a strange, sickly haze. Anyone caught inside the zone falls under the Overlord's control. Their minds are taken. Their will is gone. They become Zone Riders, mindless servants of the Overlord, their faces marked by the swirling spiral pattern that shows they have been claimed. And the zone is spreading, swallowing more of the world with each passing day. Sit with that premise for a moment. By the time the show starts, a significant portion of the entire planet is already lost. Whole nations, whole populations, already enslaved, already turned into puppets. The show opens not with a threat to be prevented, but with a catastrophe already in progress. A slow-motion apocalypse that has already claimed millions and is closing in on the rest. That is an extraordinarily bleak starting point for a children's cartoon. The people trapped inside the zone were not killed. They were worse than killed. They were still alive, still walking around, but they were no longer themselves. Their minds had been hollowed out and filled with the Overlord's will. The animation showed ordinary people, including children, with the telltale spiral marks on their faces, moving like puppets, serving a master they could not resist. The horror was not death, but the loss of self, the erasure of everything that made a person, while their body kept moving. The heroes, a small team called the Zone Riders who had protective gear that let them resist the zone's effects, were vastly outnumbered. They were a handful of people standing against a force that had already conquered half the world, and the show was honest about how desperate their situation was. They could not free the enslaved millions. They could only fight to stop the zone from spreading further and search for a way to undo the damage, knowing that every day they failed, more people were lost. What made Spiral Zone particularly unsettling was the visual of the enslaved population. These were not monsters or aliens. They were ordinary human beings, people who looked just like the viewers and their families, transformed into blank-eyed slaves. The spiral mark on their faces was a simple but deeply disturbing image, a visible sign that the person you were looking at was no longer in control of themselves. For a child watching, the idea that ordinary people, maybe even people you knew, could be turned into mindless puppets by an invisible haze was genuinely frightening. The Overlord himself was a cold and menacing villain, his face hidden, his goal nothing less than total domination of the entire planet. He did not want to destroy the world. He wanted to own it mind by mind, person by person, until everyone alive served him and no free will remained anywhere. That goal, the complete erasure of human freedom on a global scale, was darker than the simple destruction most cartoon villains threaten. He wanted a world of slaves, and he was winning. The show carried a constant atmosphere of dread. The zone was always spreading. The heroes were always outnumbered. Every victory was small and temporary against the backdrop of a world being steadily consumed. There was no sense that things were going to be okay. No comfortable assurance that the good guys had it under control. The mood was one of desperate resistance against a tide that kept rising. Spiral Zone also touched on the trauma of those who had loved ones taken by the zone. Characters had to face the reality that people they cared about were now enslaved, walking around with spiral marks on their faces, no longer themselves. The grief of losing someone who was still alive but no longer who they were is a heavy and complicated emotion. And the show did not shy away from it. It is the same grief that real people feel when illness takes a loved one's mind. And a children's cartoon put that feeling on screen. There is a particular cruelty in how Spiral Zone framed its central horror. Death, in most cartoons, was an ending, a clean break. But the Spiral Zone offered something worse than death: continuation without self. The enslaved were still there, still breathing, still walking around, but the person was gone. For the heroes, and for the children watching, this raised a terrible question. Was a Zone Rider still a person who could be saved? Or were they already lost forever? A body with no one home. The show lived in that uncertainty, and it never fully resolved it. The enslaved were both alive, and not both present and gone. And that ambiguity was more disturbing than any clean death could have been. The series was based on a toy line, and lasted a single season. The familiar fate of so many of these shows. But its premise stuck with the children who saw it. The image of the spreading haze, the blank-eyed slaves with spirals on their faces, the idea that half the world had already fallen, and the heroes were fighting a losing battle to save the rest. All of it created a mood of genuine apocalyptic dread. Unlike the bright optimism of most toy cartoons, Spiral Zone offered a world already half lost, where the best the heroes could hope for was to hold the line and slow the spread. There was no easy promise that everything would be set right. The catastrophe had already happened, and undoing it was a distant, uncertain hope rather than a guaranteed victory. Spiral Zone did not need gore or monsters to disturb its audience. It disturbed them with an idea. The idea that your mind could be taken, that you could be made into a puppet while still alive, and that this had already happened to millions of people who could not be saved. For a generation of kids, that concept lodged somewhere deep and stayed there, a quiet, creeping fear of losing yourself to something you could not see or fight. The Centurions was, on its surface, one of the most straightforwardly fun action cartoons of the decade. Three heroes who fused with powerful exoframes to become walking weapons platforms, fighting to protect the Earth. The action was big, the gadgets were elaborate, and the whole thing moved at a breakneck pace. But the villain at the center of the show, and the things he wanted to do, pushed the Centurions into genuinely disturbing territory. The antagonist was Doc Terror, and he was not a typical cartoon villain who simply wanted power or money. Doc Terror wanted to replace humanity. His goal was to merge all of mankind with machines, to strip away human individuality and free will, and turn the entire human race into a unified machine collective under his control. He believed organic life was weak and flawed, and he wanted to fix it by erasing everything that made people human. That is a genuinely chilling philosophy, and the show put it front and center. Doc Terror's own appearance reflected his obsession. He had merged his own body with machinery, and he could combine with his robotic assistant Hacker to form a single, larger mechanical being. The imagery of a man who had partly replaced his own flesh with machine, who wanted to do the same to everyone alive, carried a real body horror undertone. He was a preview of what he wanted the whole world to become. Half human and half machine, with the human part steadily being erased. The show frequently depicted Doc Terror's experiments and creations, and they leaned into the grotesque. He built cyborg monsters, fusions of living tissue and machinery that served as his soldiers. He experimented on living beings, reshaping them into weapons. The idea that this villain was constantly working in his lab to turn living things into machine hybrid horrors gave the show a dark scientific edge. He was not just attacking the world, he was trying to remake it in a twisted image, one experiment at a time. The threat Doc Terror posed was existential in a way most cartoon threats were not. He did not want to rule humanity. He wanted to end humanity as a concept to replace free individual people with a single controlled machine consciousness. The stakes were not just lives, but the very existence of human individuality and choice. If he won, there would be no more people, only components of his collective. For a children's cartoon, that was a remarkably sophisticated and frightening kind of villainy. The heroes themselves embodied a gentler version of the same human-machine fusion, which gave the show an interesting tension. The Centurions bonded with their exoframes to gain power, but they remained fully human, fully themselves, in control of the technology rather than controlled by it. The contrast was the whole point. The heroes showed humanity and technology working together in partnership, while Doc Terror showed technology consuming and erasing humanity entirely. The show was, underneath the action, a meditation on whether technology would serve people or replace them. Some of the imagery in the show was genuinely unsettling for young viewers. Doc Terror's cyborg creations were menacing fusions of flesh and metal. His lair was dark and industrial, and the recurring theme of people being turned into machines, of free will being stripped away and replaced by programming, tapped into a deep and primal fear. The fear of losing your humanity, of being turned into a thing, ran through the entire series. There were episodes where Doc Terror came close to succeeding, where his plans to convert populations or seize control of critical systems nearly worked. And the show let those moments feel genuinely dangerous. The audience was shown what a Doc Terror victory would look like. A world of converted machine people under a single cold will, and it was a deeply bleak picture. The heroes won, but the show made sure you understood exactly what they were fighting to prevent. The Centurions also dealt with the loneliness and pressure of being the only thing standing between the world and Doc Terror's vision. The three heroes carried an enormous weight, knowing that if they failed, humanity itself would end. Not in death, but in conversion, in the erasure of everything that made people people. That burden gave the show an undercurrent of seriousness beneath all the explosions and gadgets. What lingered most about the Centurions was the specific nature of the fate Doc Terror threatened. Most cartoon villains offered death or enslavement, but Doc Terror offered something that was arguably worse, and certainly stranger: assimilation. He did not want to kill you or rule you. He wanted to make you part of him, to dissolve the boundary between your mind and his machine until there was no longer a you at all. That fear, the fear of losing the boundary of the self, of being absorbed into something larger and colder, is one of the deepest fears a person can have. And the show put it at the center of a children's action cartoon, asking kids to confront the possibility of their own individuality being erased. For the kids who watched, The Centurions delivered its fun action alongside a villain whose goal was quietly one of the most horrifying in all of 80s animation. Doc Terror did not want to blow up the world. He wanted to absorb it, to turn every living person into a piece of his machine, to end human individuality forever. That idea, the erasure of the self into a controlled collective, was a sophisticated and disturbing fear to plant in young minds, and it lingered well beyond the bright action sequences that surrounded it. The show was fast and flashy and full of gadgets, and most kids remembered it fondly for the spectacle. But underneath the spectacle was a genuinely unsettling vision of a future where humanity itself was erased. Not through destruction, but through absorption. And that vision gave the Centurions a darkness that its bright surface never quite concealed. Saber Rider and the Star Sheriffs was an English adaptation of a Japanese anime, reworked for American audiences, and that origin gave it a distinctive flavor that set it apart from the homegrown toy cartoons of the era. It was a space western, all cowboys and lawmen and frontier worlds, but the threat at the center of it came from somewhere genuinely strange and frightening. Another dimension, full of monstrous beings who wanted to invade and conquer the human worlds. The villains were the Outriders, and they came from a place called the Vapor Zone, a dark dimension that existed alongside normal space. The Outriders were not human. They were grotesque, monstrous creatures, and their leader, Nemesis, commanded them from a massive fortress that could move between dimensions. The whole concept was unsettling. Beyond the normal world lay a realm of darkness full of monsters, and they could tear holes into reality to invade whenever they pleased. What made Saber Rider distinctive was how genuinely alien and threatening the Outriders felt. These were not guys in costumes or robots with personalities. They were nightmarish things from a dark dimension, and the show leaned into how wrong and frightening they were. When they appeared, tearing their way out of the Vapor Zone, the imagery was that of a horror film. Reality itself was being violated by things that should not exist. Things from a place of pure darkness. The Vapor Zone itself was a place of dread. The show depicted it as a swirling, hostile dimension, a realm of darkness and menace from which the monstrous Outriders emerged. The idea that there was this entire dark world existing just beyond the normal one, full of creatures who wanted to invade and destroy, tapped into the same primal fear as the closet monster or the thing under the bed. The darkness was not just out in space. It was in another layer of reality, always there, always pressing in. The show did not shy away from genuine peril and loss. Characters faced real danger. The Outriders were a serious, ongoing threat, and the war against them carried real weight. Because it came from Japanese animation, the series had a slightly different sensibility than American cartoons, a willingness to let moments breathe, to let the stakes feel heavy, to depict its villains as genuinely frightening rather than comically incompetent. The Outriders were not a joke. They were a horror nemesis. The villain commanding the Outriders was a cold and imposing figure, ruling his monstrous forces from his dimensional fortress. His goal was the conquest and domination of the human worlds, the spread of his dark dimension's influence across the galaxy. He was patient, intelligent, and relentless, and the heroes were locked in a long and difficult war against him, never quite able to end the threat for good. One of the recurring sources of unease in the show was the way the Outriders could appear anywhere, tearing through from their dimension without warning. There was no safe place. The frontier worlds the heroes protected could be invaded at any moment by monsters from beyond reality. That constant lurking threat gave the show an atmosphere of unease that ran beneath its space western trappings. The heroes were always watching the edges of reality, knowing that the darkness could break through at any time. The monstrous designs of the Outriders were genuinely disturbing for young viewers. They were twisted, alien, and wrong, the kind of creatures that lodged in a child's imagination. And the fact that they came from a dark dimension, a place of pure menace existing alongside the normal world, made them more frightening than ordinary villains. They were not just enemies. They were intrusions of nightmare into reality. Because Saber Rider was adapted from anime, it also carried over some of the more mature sensibilities of its source material, including a willingness to depict genuine danger, genuine loss, and a war that was difficult and costly. The American adaptation softened some elements, but the underlying darkness of the premise, monsters from a nightmare dimension invading reality, remained intact. The show retained a weight and a seriousness that distinguished it from many of its lighter peers. For the children who watched, Saber Rider delivered its frontier adventure alongside a genuinely frightening core idea. Beyond the normal world lay a dimension of darkness and monsters, and those monsters wanted in. They could tear through reality at any moment, and the only thing standing between them and the conquest of everything was a small band of star sheriffs fighting a war that never seemed to end. That image of an ever-present darkness pressing in from beyond reality stayed with the kids who saw it, a quiet unease that the normal world was thinner and more fragile than it appeared. The vapor zone was always there, just out of sight, full of things that wanted to break through and consume everything. And that fear, the fear that the safe and familiar world was only a thin membrane over a realm of darkness, tapped into something ancient and instinctive. It was the same fear that makes a child afraid of the dark, of the closet, of the space under the bed, scaled up to cosmic proportions and given a name. The Outriders were the dark made real, the monsters from beyond the edge of the world, and the show made children believe, at least a little, that such things might truly be out there, waiting for their chance to come through. Jace and the Wheeled Warriors had one of the strangest and most genuinely unsettling villain concepts of the entire decade. The bad guys were not robots or aliens or sorcerers. They were plants. Living, intelligent, malevolent plant creatures called the Monster Minds, led by a being named Sawboss, and their entire goal was to spread across the universe and consume all other life, plant and animal alike, until nothing remained but themselves. The Monster Minds were genuinely disturbing creations. They were vehicles fused with monstrous plant life, twisted hybrids of machine and aggressive vegetation. They had grasping vines, snapping jaws made of woody growths, and a relentless, mindless hunger to spread and devour. The imagery of these plant monsters, all thorns and tendrils and gnashing organic parts, was the stuff of nightmares. There was something deeply wrong about them, a corruption of nature into something predatory and endless. The premise of the show was a desperate chase across the universe. Jace, the young hero, was searching for his father, who held the other half of a magical root that could stop the Monster Minds. The two halves of the root together could defeat the plant menace. So the show was a long, anxious journey, with Jace and his companions fleeing from and fighting the Monster Minds while searching for the one thing that could end them. The tone was one of constant pursuit and constant danger. Sawboss, the leader of the Monster Minds, was a genuinely menacing villain. He was a plant creature of immense power and cold intelligence, driven by the singular goal of spreading the Monster Minds across all of existence. He did not want wealth or power in the human sense. He wanted to convert the entire universe into more of his kind, to let the Monster Minds grow and spread until they had consumed every world and every living thing. That goal, the consumption of all life, was apocalyptic in scope. What made the Monster Minds particularly unsettling was the way they spread. Like real invasive plants, they grew, took root, and overran everything in their path. The show depicted worlds being consumed by the spreading plant menace, choked and devoured by aggressive vegetation that left nothing behind. The imagery of entire planets being overrun and consumed by hungry, twisting plant life was genuinely disturbing. A vision of nature turned predatory and unstoppable. The chase format of the show gave it a relentless, anxious quality. There was never a safe haven. The Monster Minds were always pursuing, always spreading, always one step behind the heroes. Jace and his companions could never rest, never stop, because the plant menace never stopped. They lived in a state of perpetual flight, searching for the means to end a threat that grew more dangerous with every passing day. That constant, grinding pressure gave the series an undercurrent of dread. The monster minds also blurred the line between machine and organism in a way that was viscerally unsettling. They were vehicles and plants fused together, neither fully alive nor fully mechanical, a wrong and unnatural combination. Their designs emphasized the organic horror, the snapping plant jaws, the writhing vines, the thorny growths erupting from machine frames. They looked like something that should not be, and that wrongness made them genuinely frightening. There was also a real sense of stakes and loss in the show. The monster minds were a serious, ongoing threat, and the worlds they consumed did not come back. The damage they did was permanent. Jace's quest carried real weight, because failure meant the eventual consumption of everything. The show did not pretend the threat was minor or easily handled. It was an existential danger to all life, and the heroes were the only thing slowing its spread. The image at the center of the show, of aggressive, hungry plant life spreading across the universe and devouring everything, tapped into a deep and primal fear. There is something instinctively unsettling about nature turned predatory, about plants that hunt and consume and spread without end. The monster minds embodied that fear completely. They were the natural world corrupted into a relentless, devouring menace, and the show put them front and center as an unstoppable spreading horror. There is also something worth noting about how the show used the format of the endless chase to create a specific kind of unease. In most cartoons, the heroes had a home base, a place of safety to return to between adventures. Jace had none. He was always moving, always fleeing, always one step ahead of the spreading menace. There was no sanctuary, no rest, no safe harbor where the danger could not reach. That constant rootlessness, the sense of never being able to stop or feel secure, gave the series a distinctive anxiety. The monster minds were not something you could lock the door against. They were always coming, always growing, and the only response was to keep running and keep searching for the one thing that might end them. For the children who watched Jace and the Wheeled Warriors, the monster minds lodged in memory as something genuinely creepy. The thorny, vine-covered plant monsters, the worlds being consumed, the endless chase across a universe being slowly devoured, all of it created a mood of creeping, organic dread. It was a different flavor of nightmare than robots or demons, a fear of the natural world itself turning hungry and wrong. And it stayed with the kids who saw it long after the show ended. And the show never gave them the satisfaction of a clean resolution, because it was canceled before Jace could reunite the two halves of the root and end the threat. So just like the kids trapped in Dungeons & Dragons, the children watching Jace were left with no ending. The plant menace still spreading, the chase still unresolved, the universe still being devoured. The nightmare simply stopped mid-flight, leaving its young audience to imagine a cosmos still being consumed, with no hero arriving in time to save it. Part 19, The Mysterious Cities of Gold, Genocide, Exploitation, and Real Historical Horror. The Mysterious Cities of Gold was a French and Japanese co-production that aired widely in the 80s, and it was unlike almost anything else on children's television. It was a sweeping adventure following a young boy named Esteban searching for his father and the legendary cities of gold across South America in the 1500s. It was beautifully animated and genuinely educational. It was also built on a foundation of some of the darkest real history imaginable, and it did not hide that history from its young audience. The show was set during the age of Spanish colonization and conquest, and it did not pretend that this was a glorious adventure. The backdrop of the entire series was the brutal reality of the conquistadors, the violent invasion of the Americas, the exploitation and slaughter of indigenous peoples, and the greed that drove it all. A children's cartoon set itself against the backdrop of one of the great atrocities of human history, and it did not look away from what that meant. Esteban traveled alongside an Incan girl named Zia and a young thief named Dao, and through their journey, the show depicted the encounter between the European invaders and the native civilizations of the Americas. It showed the Spanish hunger for gold, the willingness to destroy entire cultures in pursuit of wealth, and the suffering of the indigenous peoples caught in the path of conquest. For many children watching, this was their first exposure to the real history of colonization, presented without the usual sanitizing. The villains of the show were often the Spanish conquistadors conquistadors themselves, driven by greed, willing to enslave, deceive, and kill in pursuit of gold. The show depicted the cruelty of conquest, the way the invaders exploited and betrayed the native peoples, the human cost of the relentless search for riches. These were not fantasy villains. They were representations of real historical figures who did real terrible things. And the show was honest about their cruelty. The mysterious cities of gold also touched on the destruction of entire civilizations. The cities of gold themselves were remnants of advanced ancient cultures, and the show explored what had happened to those cultures, the ways they had risen and fallen, the catastrophes that had befallen them. There was a deep melancholy running through the series, a sense of lost grandeur, of great civilizations reduced to ruins and legends. The weight of history, of all that had been destroyed, hung over the entire journey. The show did not shy away from danger and death. Characters faced genuine peril. The world Esteban traveled through was harsh and often deadly, full of natural hazards, hostile forces, and the ever-present threat of the conquistadors. The series treated its young protagonists as people who could genuinely be hurt or killed, and it let the stakes feel real. There was no comfortable assurance that everything would be fine. What made the Mysterious Cities of Gold particularly remarkable was how it trusted its young audience with real complexity and real darkness. It did not present a simple story of good guys and bad guys. It presented a morally complicated world, full of greed and cruelty and the genuine suffering of real peoples. It asked children to grapple with the reality that history is full of atrocity, that civilizations are destroyed, that the search for wealth has cost countless lives. These were heavy adult themes, delivered to children through the frame of an adventure story. The show also incorporated genuinely educational segments at the end of each episode, explaining the real history and cultures the story drew upon. This grounded the darkness in reality. The suffering depicted in the show was not invented. It reflected real events, real exploitation, real destruction, and by connecting the story to actual history, the show made clear that the darkness was not fantasy. It had happened. People really had done these things to other people. For the children who watched, the Mysterious Cities of Gold delivered its beautiful adventure alongside an unflinching look at some of the darkest chapters of human history. The genocide of indigenous peoples, the cruelty of conquest, the destruction of entire civilizations, the human cost of greed. All of it was woven into a story aimed at young viewers. It was a children's cartoon that refused to lie about history, that trusted its audience to handle the truth, even when that truth was genuinely horrifying. There is also a quiet, sophisticated point the show made about the nature of greed itself. The cities of gold that everyone was searching for were not just treasure, they were the focus of everyone's desire, and that desire was what drove the cruelty. The conquistadors were willing to destroy entire peoples because they wanted the gold so badly. The show let children see clearly how the hunger for wealth could turn people into monsters, how greed could justify any atrocity in the minds of those who felt it. That was a genuinely mature theme, a meditation on how desire corrupts, delivered through an adventure story aimed at young viewers. The gold was beautiful and alluring, but it was also the thing that made men cruel, and the show never let its audience forget that connection. That honesty was its own kind of darkness, perhaps the heaviest kind. There were no monsters or demons in the Mysterious Cities of Gold. The horror was real. It was the horror of what people had actually done to other people, presented to children with a seriousness and an honesty that almost no other show of the era attempted. And for the kids who absorbed it, that exposure to the real darkness of history left a mark that fantasy nightmares never could. A demon or a monster could be dismissed as make-believe once the show ended, but the knowledge that real people had really enslaved, exploited, and slaughtered other real people in pursuit of gold could not be unlearned. It settled into a generation of young viewers as a permanent understanding that the world contained genuine cruelty, that history was soaked in it, and that the comfortable adventure stories they usually watched had been hiding a much harder truth. Ulysses 31 was another French and Japanese co-production, and it took one of the oldest and darkest stories in human literature, Homer's Odyssey, and reimagined it in space. The result was a cartoon steeped in mythological horror, divine cruelty, and existential dread, following a hero cursed by the gods themselves and forced to wander through a nightmarish cosmos with no certainty he would ever find his way home. The premise was genuinely grim. Ulysses, A spacefaring hero angers the ancient gods, and as punishment, the god Zeus curses him. The curse is brutal and personal. Ulysses' crew is struck down, plunged into a death-like sleep, and his young son's companions are frozen. And Zeus decrees that Ulysses will wander the universe lost, unable to return home, until he finds the mythical kingdom of Hades. Only then might his crew be revived and his journey end. Until then, he is condemned to drift through a hostile cosmos, hunted by the gods. Think about the weight of that setup for a children's show. The hero is cursed by divine beings. His friends lie in a death-like state that he cannot reverse. He is denied his home, denied his rest, forced to wander endlessly through danger as punishment for daring to defy the gods. The entire series is built on a foundation of divine cruelty and existential suffering. The story of a man being tormented by powers far greater than himself for the crime of standing up to them. The gods of Ulysses 31 were not benevolent. They were cruel, capricious, and vengeful, exactly as the gods of Greek myth often were. They tormented Ulysses for their own reasons, placing obstacle after obstacle in his path, sending monsters and trials and horrors to test and punish him. The show depicted a universe ruled by these cruel divine powers, where a mortal who angered them could be condemned to endless suffering. That vision of an unjust cosmos, ruled by cruel gods who punish defiance, was a heavy and frightening worldview to present to children. The monsters Ulysses encountered were drawn from Greek mythology, reimagined as cosmic horrors. He faced creatures from the oldest nightmares of human storytelling. Cyclopes and sirens and beasts of myth rendered as genuinely frightening menaces. The show leaned into the horror of these encounters, depicting Ulysses and his companions in real peril, facing monsters that wanted to devour or destroy them. The mythological monsters carried the full weight of their ancient terror. The atmosphere of Ulysses 31 was one of melancholy and dread. The hero was alone, cursed, his friends lost in a death-like sleep, wandering a cosmos that seemed designed to torment him. There was a deep sadness running through the series. The sadness of a man denied his home and his rest, carrying the weight of his cursed crew, pressing on through endless trials with no guarantee of relief. The show did not offer easy comfort. It offered the long, hard journey of a hero suffering under a divine curse. The presence of the death-like sleep that had claimed Ulysses' crew was a constant, heavy reminder of the stakes. His friends were not dead, but they were not alive either. They lay in suspended animation, neither here nor gone, and the only way to free them was to complete an impossible journey through the realm of the dead itself. That image of loved ones trapped in a state between life and death, dependent on a journey that might never succeed, gave the series a persistent undercurrent of grief and desperation. The kingdom of Hades, the realm of the dead that Ulysses had to find, hung over the entire show as both goal and threat. The hero's salvation lay in finding the land of the dead, a destination that was itself a place of darkness and fear. The show built its entire arc around a journey toward death's domain, asking children to follow a hero whose only hope lay in reaching the underworld. That was a profoundly dark structure for a children's program, a quest whose destination was the realm of the dead. Ulysses 31 also retained the philosophical and existential weight of its source material. The Odyssey is, at its heart, a story about suffering, perseverance, the cruelty of fate, and the long, painful journey home. The cartoon preserved that weight. It was a story about endurance in the face of divine cruelty, about holding on to hope through endless torment, about the long suffering of a man who would not give up even as the gods themselves arrayed against him. For the children who watched, Ulysses 31 delivered its space adventure alongside some of the heaviest themes imaginable: divine cruelty, a hero cursed and tormented, friends trapped between life and death, a journey toward the realm of the dead, an unjust cosmos ruled by vengeful gods. These were the ancient nightmares of human storytelling, 3,000 years old, reimagined for a new generation, and delivered to children through the frame of a science fiction cartoon. And the dread at its core? The sense of a hero suffering under powers beyond his control, sailing endlessly through a hostile universe toward the land of the dead? Lodged deep in the minds of the kids who followed his cursed journey. What is perhaps most remarkable about Ulysses 31 is that it did not invent its darkness. It inherited it. The story of the Odyssey has been frightening and heavy for 3,000 years, full of monsters and divine cruelty, and the long suffering of a man kept from his home. The cartoon simply carried that ancient weight forward, refusing to lighten it for its young audience. In doing so, it connected the children watching to one of the oldest dark stories in the human tradition, the same story that had unsettled and moved listeners since before history was written. The kids who watched Ulysses sail through his cursed cosmos were experiencing, without knowing it, the same dread that ancient audiences felt listening to Homer by firelight. That continuity, that thread of ancient nightmare running straight into a 1980s children's cartoon, made Ulysses 31 one of the most genuinely mythic and haunting shows of the entire decade. It did not just frighten children. It connected them to the deep old darkness at the root of human storytelling, and that connection left a mark that few other cartoons could match. 20 cartoons. 20 different ways that the entertainment of a single decade reached into the minds of children, and left something dark behind. A hero turning gray on a medical slab. A boy dead in a clubhouse with an empty vial beside him. A family melting in a man's arms. Ponies dragged into demonic slavery. Orphans sold to a robed figure for a fiery ritual. Plants devouring the universe. A man cursed by the gods to wander toward the land of the dead. Laid out together, the sheer volume of darkness is staggering. This was not one bad apple, one rogue episode that slipped through. This was an entire decade of children's programming that, over and over, refused to look away from death, loss, horror, and despair. So what was going on? Why did the cartoons of the 1980s, the shows designed to sell toys and fill Saturday mornings, end up being some of the darkest children's entertainment ever produced? How did a single decade give us a robot hero bleeding out on a medical slab, a child dying of an overdose, a man watching his family melt, ponies dragged into demonic slavery, and orphans sold for a satanic ritual in a Christmas special? The answer is a strange mix of carelessness, ambition, and a different understanding of what children could handle. The 1980s were a unique moment in the history of children's animation. The rules were looser, the oversight was thinner, and the people making these shows came from wildly different backgrounds, with wildly different ideas about what was appropriate. Part of it was simply the production environment. Many of these shows were animated overseas by studios with their own sensibilities, working from scripts that passed through fewer hands than they would today. Things slipped through. A melting family here, a dying child there. The American studios that commissioned the work did not always catch what their overseas partners produced, and the overseas partners did not always share American ideas about what children should see. The result was a strange collision of cultures, and in that gap, darkness flourished. Part of it was ambition. Some of these creators genuinely wanted to make something more than a toy commercial. They wanted to tell real stories, with real stakes, and real consequences. The people who killed Optimus Prime, even if the decision was driven by business, gave the moment genuine weight. The people who made the price on Bravestar wanted to tell children the truth about drugs, and they refused to soften it. The people behind the mysterious Cities of Gold trusted children with real history, including its horrors. These were not always cynical choices. Sometimes they were the choices of creators who respected their young audience enough to be honest with them, even when honesty hurt. And part of it was simple miscalculation. The Hasbro executives who killed Optimus Prime genuinely did not understand what they had. They saw a product line. The children saw family. That gap between how the creators saw their work and how the audience experienced it is where so much of the trauma lived. The adults thought they were making disposable entertainment to sell plastic. The children were forming some of the deepest emotional bonds of their young lives. And when those two understandings collided, the result was a generation of kids genuinely wounded by things the adults thought were trivial. There is also something to be said about the era itself. The 1980s were not a gentle decade. They were shadowed by real fears. The threat of nuclear war, the panic around drugs, anxieties about crime and danger, and those fears bled into the entertainment, even the entertainment made for children. The anti-drug episodes, the apocalyptic premises, the villains who wanted to enslave or erase humanity. All of it reflected the real anxieties of the time. The cartoons were dark partly because the world that made them was anxious, and that anxiety found its way onto the screen. What is remarkable is how much these dark moments stuck. Ask anyone who grew up in the 80s about these shows, and they will not tell you about the happy episodes or the toy-selling adventures. They will tell you about the death of Optimus Prime, about the kid who overdosed on Bravestar, about Shipwreck's melting family, about the Smurfs Christmas special. The darkness is what survived. The darkness is what became legend. Because the darkness is what mattered. It is what made these shows feel real. What gave them weight. What turned disposable toy commercials into formative experiences that a generation never forgot. There is an argument that all of this was bad, that children should have been protected from these images, that no kid needed to watch a hero die or a child overdose, or a family melt. And there is truth in that. Some of these moments were genuinely too much, delivered without warning, to audiences far too young to process them. The trauma was real, and for some children, it lingered for years. But there's also another argument that children are more resilient and more perceptive than adults often give them credit for, and that being shown real stakes, real loss, and real consequences taught a generation something valuable, that the kids who watched Optimus Prime die learned that loss is real and survivable, that the kids who watched The Price understood the danger of drugs in a way no gentle lecture could ever convey, that being trusted with darkness, even painful darkness, was a kind of respect. The shows did not condescend. They did not pretend the world was safe and simple. And the children who absorbed those lessons grew up knowing that stories could hurt, that heroes could fall, and that the world contained real darkness. But that it could be faced. Both things are probably true. The 80s went too far, again and again, in ways that genuinely wounded the children watching. And in going too far, those shows created some of the most memorable, formative, and meaningful moments in the entire history of children's entertainment. The trauma and the value were tangled together, inseparable, two sides of the same unflinching coin. What is certain is that we will probably never see anything like it again. Children's entertainment today is more carefully managed, more thoroughly vetted, more protective of its young audience. The gaps that let a melting family or an overdosing child slip through have largely closed, and so the dark cartoons of the 80s stand as a strange, singular artifact of a vanished moment, a time when the people making children's television were willing, whether through ambition or carelessness or genuine respect, to show kids the darkness. The children who grew up on these shows carry them still. The images are burned in deep. The death of a hero, the loss of a friend, the melting of a family, the dragging of innocence into the dark. They were too young to fully understand what they were seeing, but they understood enough to never forget. And decades later, those moments remain lodged in memory, a permanent reminder that once, for one strange decade, the cartoons were not afraid to break your heart. That was the price of 80s animation, and a whole generation paid it, one traumatizing Saturday morning at a time. It is easy, looking back, to laugh at some of it. The Smurfs doing a child trafficking Christmas special, a drug dealer disguised as a baby fairy, the casual absurdity of a planet-eating robot voiced by Orson Welles. There is a comedy in how completely the people making these shows misjudged what they were doing. But underneath the comedy is something real and lasting. These shows shaped a generation. They were the first stories many children ever encountered that took death seriously, that admitted the world contained genuine cruelty, that refused to promise everything would be fine, and for better and for worse, that shaped how an entire generation understood stories and understood the world. Maybe that is the real legacy of the dark cartoons of the 80s. Not the specific traumas, the individual scenes that scarred individual children, but the broader lesson they taught collectively, that stories have weight, that choices have consequences, that heroes are mortal and the world is dangerous, and not everyone gets saved. The children who grew up on these shows became adults who understood, on some deep level absorbed before they could even articulate it, that the world is not a safe and simple place. They learned it from cartoons, from toys, from Saturday morning TV, and whether that knowledge was a wound or a gift, or both at once, it stayed with them for the rest of their lives.